I still remember the exact weight of the air that morning, thick with humidity, heavy with the kind of tension you can't name until it's staring you in the face. As my moving truck rumbled through the gated entrance of Crestwood Estates, a neighborhood that, from the glossy brochures and drone-shot photos online, was supposed to be a slice of suburban perfection. Tree-lined streets curling gracefully into cul-de-sacs, manicured lawns so green they looked airbrushed, and houses designed to look unique while somehow managing to all feel eerily the same. It was the kind of place realtors described as exclusive and prestigious, while conveniently leaving out that it was also the stomping ground of one of the most aggressively self-important HOAs in the county, a detail I was already aware of, but hadn't yet decided how much fun I was going to have with. I was barely halfway through the gate when I saw them. 3 people in pressed polo shirts and clipboards, standing in a perfect little wedge formation just inside the entrance like they'd been practicing for this moment. And when the security arm lifted, they didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't even pretend to be welcoming. They just stepped into the lane like traffic cops and motioned for me to pull over. Their expressions caught somewhere between officious authority and the smugness of someone who thinks they've already won a game you didn't know you were playing. I eased the truck to the curb, rolled down the window, and the tallest of the 3, a man in his late 50s with silver hair that looked like it had been combed with a ruler, stepped forward and introduced himself as Marvin K. Lattimore, president of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association, his voice carrying the kind of artificial warmth that melts away the second you question it. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, handing me a glossy folder with the Crestwood logo embossed in gold. "We just need to take care of a few quick things before you settle in." And behind him, the 2 others, a sharp-faced woman with horn-rimmed glasses and a shorter man whose belly strained against his tucked-in shirt, stood nodding like background actors in a commercial, the woman scribbling notes on a clipboard as if my arrival was being graded. Marvin flipped the folder open for me like a magician revealing a trick and pointed to the first sheet, which looked like an invoice. "As a new resident, you're required to pay the one-time new owner compliance fee of $2,650 today. Cash, check, or money order. It covers your registration, inspection, and neighborhood integration process," he said, that last phrase rolling off his tongue like it was a perfectly normal thing to say, and I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow, because not only had I never heard of such a fee in the disclosure documents when I bought the property, but the way he said "today" made it sound less like a formality and more like a stick-up. I kept my voice level, almost casual, as I asked where in the bylaws this fee was listed, and Marvin's smile twitched just slightly before he said, "Oh, it's in the supplemental guidelines, which aren't always included in the closing packet, but don't worry, it's standard procedure here." And when I asked to see those guidelines, the horn-rimmed woman, who I later learned was their treasurer, Patricia, cut in sharply with, "We don't just hand those out to anyone, sir, only to registered residents, and you aren't registered until you've paid the fee," which, if you think about it, is the kind of circular logic you'd expect from someone running a scam, but not the kind you expect them to say out loud in front of witnesses. The shorter man, whose name turned out to be Doug, leaned in and said, "Look, buddy, we don't make the rules. Just pay the fee and you'll be on your way," his tone slipping from faux friendly to faintly menacing in under a sentence. And I realized this was the moment, the opening scene in a play they'd probably performed for every new arrival for years, milking hundreds or thousands in compliance fees from people too overwhelmed or intimidated to push back. What they didn't know, and what I had no intention of revealing just yet, was that my purchase of the property hadn't been some casual real estate deal, but a very deliberate, strategic acquisition tied to a holding company I owned. A company that just happened to hold the master lease on every square inch of HOA-owned common property in Crestwood Estates, including their office space, their clubhouse, and even the land under their precious community pool. In other words, Marvin and his clipboard brigade were, quite literally, my tenants, They paid me to exist. And while I could have ended the conversation right there by dropping that fact on the table like a bomb, I decided instead to lean back in my seat, glance at the fake invoice, and say with a faint smile, "Sure, why don't you give me a minute to look through this folder while I park the truck?" Because there's a certain kind of satisfaction in letting someone dig their own hole deeper before you take the shovel away. Marvin nodded, clearly thinking he'd gotten his hook in me, and as they stepped back to wave me toward the cul-de-sac, I caught Patricia jotting something on her clipboard with a smirk. Maybe compliance fee paid soon, or mark this one as an easy target. And I thought, oh, Patricia, you really have no idea how much rent you're going to owe me by the time I'm done here. The first thing I did after parking the moving truck and stepping into my new house wasn't unpacking boxes or checking the water pressure or even sitting down to catch my breath. It was walking straight to the mahogany desk in the corner of my study, flipping open my leather portfolio, and pulling out the thick binder of acquisition documents that had been the reason I bought this property in the first place. In the weeks before closing, while the HOA thought they were reviewing me as a potential buyer, I had been reviewing them, combing through county records, lease agreements, and obscure filings buried so deep in the public registry that most people didn't even know they existed, but I did. And I knew how to read them like a road map. There it was in black and white, Crestwood Estates. Homeowners Association didn't own the land their office building sat on, didn't own the strip of asphalt they called HOA reserved parking, didn't own the patch of manicured grass that served as their precious event lawn. All of it was leased from Crestwood Commercial Holdings, LLC, which, in a delicious twist of irony, was a subsidiary of my own company, Blue Arc Properties. It had been one of those sleepy little investments I'd made years ago, a bundle of commercial land parcels that came with long-term leases to various tenants, a dentist's office here, a daycare there. And at the time, Crestwood's administrative office was just another line item in the portfolio, a tenant paying their rent like everyone else. But over the years, as the HOA had expanded its reach and puffed itself up into a self-proclaimed governing authority, they'd gotten sloppy, assuming their little patch of land was theirs by right, never bothering to renegotiate or buy it outright, and now, all these years later, here I was, standing on my own porch with the ink barely dry on my deed, listening to them demand a $2,750 compliance fee they had invented out of thin air. It was almost too perfect. Still, I wasn't about to march over there and slam the lease in their faces, because power is best applied quietly at first, like the slow tightening of a vice. So instead, I decided to play the role of the polite, slightly confused new resident, nodding at their demands and giving them just enough rope to hang themselves. That afternoon, while a couple of movers hauled in my furniture, I made a few calls. One to my attorney, asking him to pull the most recent rent payment history from Crestwood's account, and one to my property manager, a sharp woman named Elise, who'd been running the commercial portfolio for years and knew every tenant's quirks. "Oh, the HOA?" she said with a chuckle when I mentioned them. "Yeah, they're interesting. Always late with their rent, always trying to negotiate special terms. Why?" I told her I'd just bought a home inside their jurisdiction, and she let out a laugh so sharp it could cut glass. "Well, that's going to make the next lease renewal very interesting," she said, and I could hear the gears turning in her head the same way they were turning in mine. I spent the next 2 days watching them from a distance, noting how Marvin would drive his golf cart around the neighborhood like a general inspecting troops, how Patricia would corner residents outside their homes with a clipboard in hand, issuing reminder notices for things as trivial as a garden gnome or a slightly faded mailbox, and how Doug mostly hovered near the clubhouse, chatting with landscapers and acting like the unofficial gatekeeper. I also made a point to chat casually with a few neighbors, and it didn't take long for the horror stories to spill out. Fines for leaving a trash can out an extra hour, threats of liens for having the wrong shade of beige on a garage door, even a rumor that the HOA had forced a widow to tear down her late husband's shed because it wasn't architecturally harmonious. Each story was another drop of gasoline on the slow-burning fire I was building. By the end of the week, Elise had emailed me a tidy little spreadsheet showing the HOA's rent history. 3 late payments in the last year, each with a penalty. They had yet to settle, and a scanned copy of their lease agreement, which, in a particularly poetic twist, included a clause giving the landlord, me, the right to terminate the lease with 60 days' notice if the tenant engaged in fraudulent or unlawful activity. I printed that clause out in bold and taped it inside the back cover of my leather portfolio, a silent promise to myself that before long it was going to be the most important piece of paper in Crestwood Estates. The next time Marvin saw me, I was standing on my driveway sipping coffee, and he strolled over with that same ruler-combed hair and plastic smile, asking if I'd gotten the fee taken care of yet. I smiled back, told him I was still reviewing my options, and the way his smile tightened told me he wasn't used to people taking more than a day to comply. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't just reviewing my options, I was designing the trap. By the second week in Crestwood Estates, I had settled into a strange routine. Mornings spent pretending to be just another homeowner, afternoons spent quietly pulling threads that I knew would unravel the HOA's perfect little tapestry, and every move I made was deliberate, calculated to look harmless on the surface while tightening the noose beneath. The first real tug on that rope came when I instructed Elise, my property manager, to send the HOA a formal, routine compliance inspection notice for their leased office space, citing a clause in the lease that allowed the landlord to inspect the premises with 48 hours' notice. Normally, such an inspection would be little more than a formality, a quick look around to ensure nothing was damaged, but I knew it would rattle them, because petty tyrants don't like anyone checking their compliance. Sure enough, the morning after the notice landed in their inbox, I saw Marvin pacing outside the HOA office, cell phone glued to his ear, his free hand cutting sharp lines through the air as if he could wave away whatever storm he felt coming. When Elise and I arrived for the inspection, clipboards in hand, Patricia was waiting for us with a brittle smile and a stack of papers she clearly thought would intimidate us. Some kind of HOA operational immunity policy, she claimed, exempted them from landlord inspections. I let her finish her little performance before calmly pointing out that the HOA didn't own the building, that their policy was irrelevant to the lease they'd signed, and that the lease, my lease, was the only contract that mattered here. The color drained from her face just enough for me to know she understood, and I filed that reaction away for later. Inside, we documented several minor violations: an overloaded electrical outlet, an unapproved wall partition, and, my personal favorite, a locked storage closet labeled Archives that Marvin refused to open, claiming it contained sensitive HOA documents. I made a note of it, thanked them for their time, and left, knowing the real damage wasn't the violations themselves, but the seed of uncertainty I'd just planted. The realization that I could walk into their sanctum anytime I pleased. The next week, I escalated things quietly by having Elise send a rent reconciliation request, a dry, bureaucratic letter itemizing their outstanding late fees and demanding payment within 15 business days. It was a legitimate request, completely above board, but I knew the timing would make it sting. The same day the letter was delivered, I attended my first HOA board meeting as a homeowner. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, another property they didn't own. And as I sat there listening to Marvin drone on about landscaping budgets and community uniformity standards, I could see the tension in his jaw every time his eyes flicked toward me. When it came time for open comments, I stood up, thanked the board for welcoming me to the neighborhood, and casually asked why the HOA's new owner compliance fee wasn't listed anywhere in the recorded bylaws. Marvin gave a rehearsed answer about supplemental guidelines, but I didn't press. I just smiled, nodded, and sat back down, knowing that my question had been heard by every homeowner in the room. After the meeting, 2 neighbors quietly approached me in the parking lot, both saying they'd been charged the same fee and had always wondered if it was legal. I told them to keep an eye on their mailboxes over the next few weeks. that there might be developments, and I could see the spark of curiosity and maybe hope in their eyes. The next move was bolder. I instructed Elise to send a second letter, this one invoking the fraudulent activity clause in their lease, not to terminate it yet, but to notify them that we were conducting a formal review of their operations to determine whether their practices were in violation. Marvin's response came within hours, a tersely worded email demanding a meeting to clear up misunderstandings. I agreed, but only on my terms, in my home, with Elise present, and with the meeting recorded for documentation purposes. When they arrived, Marvin tried to open with small talk, but I cut straight to the point. I laid the lease on the table, pointed to the clauses they'd been skirting, and then, slowly, deliberately, I slid a copy of their own fake compliance fee invoice across the table. "Do you see the problem here?" I asked, and for the first time since I'd met him, Marvin didn't have a ready answer. Patricia tried to jump in, claiming it was a miscommunication, but I stopped her cold by reading aloud the relevant county statute on fraudulent fees in HOA governance. I didn't threaten them. Not yet. I just let the silence hang, until it was unbearable, then thanked them for their time and walked them to the door. By the end of that week, the tone of every interaction with the HOA had shifted. Marvin's golf cart patrols were fewer. Patricia's driveway confrontations had all but disappeared, and Doug avoided eye contact entirely, because they were starting to realize that the man they'd tried to scam on day one wasn't just another resident. He was their landlord, their creditor, and, if I chose, the man who could evict them from their own seat of power. It was a Tuesday evening when the final act began. The kind of warm, heavy evening where the air feels like it's holding its breath, and as I walked toward the Crestwood clubhouse, the same clubhouse they didn't own, the same building, whose rent checks came to me every month, I could feel the weight of what was about to happen settle in like the slow roll of thunder before a storm. The board had called an urgent community meeting in response to what they described in a flyer as malicious misinformation circulating among residents, which I found almost flattering, given that the so-called misinformation was simply the truth they'd spent years burying. The clubhouse was full, every chair taken, people lining the walls, the buzz of whispered speculation hanging in the air, and at the front table sat Marvin, Patricia, and Doug, their usual smug composure, replaced by a brittle tightness that betrayed how rattled they were. Marvin opened with a speech about protecting the integrity of the neighborhood, but I could hear the strain in his voice, see the way his hands gripped the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright. When he invited open comments, from the floor I stood, the leather portfolio in my hand feeling heavier than ever, and walked slowly to the microphone, letting the silence build until the only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fans. "My name is Name," I began. "I moved here less than a month ago, and on my very first day, this board attempted to charge me a $2,350 new owner compliance fee, a fee not listed anywhere in our recorded bylaws or legally recognized under county statute." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd, homeowners leaning toward one another, and I held up the original invoice Marvin had handed me, letting everyone see the bold black numbers and the HOA logo at the top. "I've since learned," I continued, "that many of you have been charged similar fees, and that the money collected has never been properly disclosed in the HOA's financial statements." Patricia started to rise, her mouth opening for some rehearsed rebuttal, but I raised my hand and she froze, because that was when I laid the second document on the podium, their lease agreement, with my company's name at the top. "For those of you who don't know," I said, turning slightly to face the room, "the HOA doesn't own this clubhouse, or the land it sits on, or even the parking lot outside. They lease it from me through my company, and that lease contains a clause allowing me to terminate it within 60 days if the tenant engages in fraudulent or unlawful activity." The room went very still, the kind of stillness that only comes when a collective realization hits like a lightning strike. Marvin's face had gone pale. Doug was staring down at the table like a schoolboy caught cheating on a test, and Patricia's pen had frozen mid-tap. "As of this afternoon," I said, sliding a third document from my portfolio, "that clause has been invoked. You have 60 days to vacate these premises and relocate all HOA operations." The gasp that went through the room was almost physical, a wave of sound and energy as neighbors turned to one another with wide eyes. "Furthermore," I added, "I'll be forwarding all documentation of these unlawful fees to the county HOA compliance office, and I will be personally assisting any resident here who wishes to file for restitution." I let that sink in, then stepped back from the microphone, portfolio in hand, and walked slowly toward the exit, not looking back until I reached the door. And when I did, I saw something I'll never forget. Marvin slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the lease in front of him, Patricia whispering furiously to Doug, her hands trembling, and the residents, the very people they'd bullied for years, now standing, some clapping, some simply shaking their heads in disbelief, but all of them watching me as if they'd just witnessed the moment a tyrant's crown was knocked to the floor. By the time I stepped into the warm night air, I could feel the shift in the neighborhood. The reign of Marvin and his petty little regime was over, and the irony was almost poetic. They'd tried to scam me minutes after I arrived, and in doing so, they'd handed me the leverage to dismantle them completely, all because they'd forgotten one simple fact. I was the one who collected their rent.